around 8,000 years ago, on a lovely autumn day in Mesolithic northern Europe, a disaster of unimaginable proportions struck and changed the continent's character forever. A giant tsunami of the kind that Europe has never seen before or since, triggered by an undersea landslide of ginormous proportions. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain had nowhere to run and were mere sitting ducks as monster waves slammed into the north and east coast of the island, one after the other, wiping out a huge chunk of the region's population. However, Britain was not even the worst affected victim of these monster waves. That unfortunate distinction went to a once giant landmass. Doggerland, the lushest and most densely populated region in northern Europe at the time, which was lost beneath the waves forever. This is the map of Europe that we are all used to seeing, and it is perhaps easy to make the mistake of thinking this is how the continent has always looked. However, rewind several thousand years to the end of the last ice age, and all the Earth's continents, including Europe, looked very, very different. Europe's sea level at the time was a staggering 122 meters lower than it is today, which means that there was a lot more exposed land. In fact, sea levels were so low that Great Britain was not an island at the time, being connected to mainland Europe by a low-lying landmass, now called Doggerland, which was comparable in size to Britain itself. While this part of Europe was not heavily populated by either Homo sapiens or Neanderthals during the Ice Age, the situation changed very rapidly as the planet started warming. As the ice caps retreated, prehistoric humans pushed north, and when they set foot in Doggerland for the first time, they would have hardly been able to believe their eyes. This was a land littered with low hills, broad valleys, braided rivers, wide estuaries, marshy wetlands, and long gravel beaches. It was teeming with life, being home to bears, boars, red deer, and other wildlife, while it also hosted a wide variety of plants as well as hazelnuts and berries, along with other fruits and seeds. In other words, this was a literal paradise for early hunters and foragers, and unsurprisingly, before long, it became among the most populated regions of the time as more and more Mesolithic humans made their way up to Doggerland. It is estimated that around 100,000 people called this region home at the time, but the migration did not stop at Doggerland, as some settlers started pushing into Britain. Archaeological findings suggest that the early inhabitants of Doggerland and Britain had a nomadic lifestyle, but there is also evidence to suggest that these populations were quite advanced for their time, as we have discovered a sophisticated array of tools, weapons, clothes, and containers in the region. This was a vibrant world with plenty of cooperation and intermingling, and was among the best places to live during that period. Sadly, these people, who were living in a time of excess and enjoying the bountiful resources all around them, would not have had the faintest inkling of the catastrophe that was going to hit them from the north. Truth be told, even much before the giant North Sea tsunami hit, Doggerland's golden age was coming to an end. As the planet started becoming warmer, more of the polar ice caps melted, sea levels rose, and the shorelines vanished. Soon, the fertile lands of this region were replaced by marshes, and the size of Doggerland started shrinking rapidly. While the inhabitants of Britain and Doggerland would have adapted to these undesirable environmental changes, little did they realize that the worst was still yet to come. You see, the melting polar ice caps did not just lead to rising sea levels, but also gave way to some major shifts off the coast of Norway, which was to spell doom for the land masses down south. Far beneath the seabed, huge chambers of methane were beginning to thaw due to the warming temperatures, which destabilized Norway's continental shelf. This release of gas from underneath the shelf, combined with the melting of ice caps above ground, was a deadly combination, leading to plenty of earthquakes. At some point around 6,200 BC, the biggest earthquake of the lot struck, and this led to one of the biggest underwater landslides in the planet's history off the west coast of Norway. Known as the Storegga Slides, the incident saw 300 kilometers of continental shelf collapsing, displacing a hardly believable 3,500 cubic kilometers of debris in one go. To put that into perspective, if that had happened on land, the debris would have been enough to bury the whole of the Netherlands and Belgium combined. One cannot even begin to imagine the amount of seawater that would have been rapidly displaced by this catastrophic incident. This huge displacement of water created a massive wave, a powerful wall of water that radiated out in all directions and headed straight for the coastline. We now have evidence that this incident happened during autumn, possibly around late October, which was terrible news for the hunter-gatherers living in Britain and Doggerland, who always moved to settlements along the coast during autumn after living and hunting inland during the summer. Almost all of the estimated 150,000 people living in the two regions would have been concentrated along the coasts. The first abnormal thing that the people living on some parts of the ancient British coast would have noticed is the sea retreating a considerable distance backwards. While people living in tsunami-prone areas like Japan have known from time immemorial that this is a sign that a tsunami was on its way, the Mesolithic Europeans would have had no way of knowing what this meant, as tsunamis do not occur in this region. The ancient British hunter-gatherers would have undoubtedly been awestruck by the retreating sea, and may have even seen it as an act of divine intervention from whatever god they worshipped. It might have even attracted more people closer to the coast to catch a glimpse of this extremely rare phenomenon, thus setting the stage for Northern Europe's worst ever disaster. Just a few minutes after the sea had retreated, the Mesolithic Britons would have witnessed a stomach-churning sight. In the distance, they would have seen a wave 130 feet high dominating the horizon, travelling towards them at an astonishing speed of 30 meters per second. At those speeds, the waves are not dissimilar to walls of concrete, which would have devoured everything in its path. One can imagine the sheer panic, hysteria, and terror that would have descended on these coastal communities when they saw this wave speeding right towards them. The monster wave would have crashed into the coast with unbelievable energy and ferocity, even before the Mesolithic inhabitants could have shouted out to their loved ones. In a flash, the seawater would have gobbled up vast settlements, leaving nothing in its wake as it sped inland. The same phenomenon would have then repeated across Scotland and the rest of Britain, sweeping entire coastal communities away without a trace. If that was not enough, two more similar waves would follow in quick succession, serving as a knockout punch for many of these communities, dooming the ancient first responders who had been trying to help those battling for their lives after the impact of the first wave. Such was the scale of these waves that even settlements a whole day's travel from the sea were wiped out, many of them almost instantaneously. According to estimates, a quarter of the entire population of Britain perished during this catastrophe, making the North Sea tsunami one of the deadliest natural disasters per capita in Britain's entire history, comparable to the Black Plague. To put that into perspective, an equivalently deadly disaster in the present day would have led to a whopping 16 million deaths in Great Britain alone. However, despite this cataclysmic devastation, it turns out that Britain actually had it easy compared to its neighbour. You see, unlike Britain, Doggerland was an extremely low-lying region, standing at an average of just 5 meters above sea level. And unlike modern-day Netherlands, there was no seawall to protect these ancient people. The inhabitants of this region thus never stood a chance, as the monster waves would have completely washed over what was left of Doggerland, which had already been devastated by rising sea levels. Out of Doggerland's estimated population of 100,000 at the time, not many would have had a chance to survive, and the few who did would have succumbed to starvation over the next 12 months. There is also evidence that the scarcity of resources after this giant tsunami saw communities across Northern Europe turn to war and violence over the subsequent decades in a bid to survive. In short, within the blink of an eye, the geography and the cultures of these lands became completely unrecognizable, completely cutting off Great Britain from the European mainland. With no warning, the ocean, which would have likely been worshipped by these communities for its life-giving properties, suddenly turned on them with devastating effect, wiping out entire oral histories that would have been narrated in these areas for many millennia. The handful of survivors from Doggerland would have no choice but to migrate to Britain, as their paradise became uninhabitable. There is even a theory that it was the ancestors of the inhabitants of Doggerland who would go on to settle in Scotland and build Stonehenge around 5,000 years ago. Since there were no written records at this time, It is impossible to tell what exactly the Mesolithic Northern Europeans were going through, but there is no doubt that these cultures would have dealt with intergenerational trauma for centuries after seeing their entire world turned upside down by the ocean in a blink of an eye. Through archaeological work, it is up to us to continue piecing together the story of these unfortunate souls, whose hopes, dreams, beliefs, customs, tales, and traditions were buried beneath the waves forever, with the quiet, shallow waters of the North Sea bearing no trace of the thriving communities who once called it home. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you want to learn more about such unique tales and ideas, subscribe to the channel. We will continue bringing you stories that blow your mind, as the truth, as they say, is stranger than fiction.